complexities within contemporary notions of interchangeable identities and cultural difference, as experienced between her past and present cultures and homelands. Next, we have Deborah Kelly, a socially and politically engaged artist working across installation, collage, and performative interventions. Her work explores and questions issues of gender, power, and privilege. Julie Ewington is an independent writer and curator focusing on contemporary Australian art. From 1997 to 2014, she led the Australian Art Department at QA Goma and was the curator in the Asia Pacific Triennial exhibitions from 1996 to 2012. Over 4 decades, she has worked as an academic on the boards of many organisations. She was the founding member of the Women's Art Movement in Adelaide in 1976 and the Arts Workers Union Sydney in 79 and 80. And finally, we have Vincent Silk, a writer who lives in Naarm, Melbourne. He works in the mediums of fiction and non-fiction. His first novel, Sisters of No Mercy, a speculative fiction sci-fi haste, is out in October 2018. Alongside his current practice, he is involved in a community education project called Undercurrent Victoria, which is a collective-run project focusing on prevention of relationship violence and sexual assault. Please join me in welcoming our panellists. One of NAVA's policy priorities is that gender disparity in fees, opportunity and representation are overcome through policy and regulation. So we are doing lots of work in this area. The metoo movement sparked an increase in the number of complaints reported to NAVA regarding gendered harassment and assault in our industry. The NAVA team thought very carefully about how best to make a constructive, impactful contribution that was strong enough to empower change. So in March this year, we released a public letter to perpetrators of gendered harassment. It's called Dear Person I've Been Reluctant to Keep Engaging With, but have had to for professional reasons. This letter was released in text as well as video, performed by leading Australian artists and arts workers, and was published with a set of resources. So to kick this conversation off today, we're going to show this video.
Dear person I've been reluctant to keep engaging with.
I've had to for professional reasons.
I know this is going to come as a surprise to you.
But I have to tell you something, and it's going to make you feel deeply uncomfortable about who you are and how you come across.
You're a perpetrator of gendered harassment.
Habitually, routinely, and thoughtlessly, you make people feel uncomfortable.
Because you sexualize the way you touch them, talk to them, or talk about them.
And I am one of those people.
I've tried all the various ways I could think of to stop you from behaving that way towards me.
But none of them have worked.
You've brushed it off as a joke, or said it's just your way, just what it's like working in a creative environment. You've never stopped to think about how that affects someone day to day.
There are even times when you have passed it off as a compliment about my culture or ethnicity.
You've never stopped to think about how it affects our entire culture when there's countless people just like you who go on behaving that way.
Oblivious to their effect.
There have been times when your behaviour has gone beyond gendered harassment.
You didn't notice because you didn't realise that that was sexual assault.
You didn't realise that you touched me in that way because in your position of power, you've long felt entitled to behave however was most comfortable for you without considering the other.
You didn't realise that touching me the way that you did in public, while I was in the middle of doing my job, or just at an opening,
or even at my own opening, was not only horrible,
but against the law.
You're probably wondering why I've never mentioned this before, in terms as strong and as clear as this.
I didn't think you had any idea of how hard it is to say all of this. To realise that, despite all the work I have made and shown,
I have been diminished into the object of someone else's momentary sexual gratification, just an object and nothing more.
That is an abhorrent feeling.
It disconnects you from yourself and everything you've achieved.
And all the times you've just laughed it off, I've felt even more humiliated.
On top of all of that, I've been worried about how it would hurt my career, how you might retaliate.
I've heard the way you speak about people. I've heard how rumour can ruin reputations.
And I'm disgusted that despite the fact that everyone seems to know all of this about you,
people keep giving you great jobs and putting you on committees and giving you even more power over the careers of people like me.
The only alternative to sending you this letter was not to send it, and that would mean I'd continue to feel uncomfortable and undermined and unsafe.
And who knows how many others would be feeling the same way.
I've seen you with other people. I've seen their bodies stiffen and their facial expression freeze.
I've wondered, how on earth could this be possible? That you haven't noticed it too.
And so instead of contributing to the bottomless mire of material designed to agitate the victims of gendered harassment into changing our behaviour,
I'm offering ways that you can change yours.
There have been dozens and dozens of times when you've been talking to someone and suddenly their demeanour has changed, or they've moved away from you abruptly.
Ask yourself why. I mean, really ask yourself, why? What were you saying? What were you doing? How could you have done any of that differently?
I know you've recognized this behavior in others. Why haven't you said anything?
Maybe now, reading this letter, and I know you're going to reread it and reread it, because it's a really unsettling thing to receive.
Maybe now you'll find some way to say something.
Maybe you'll find some way to stop yourself when you've moved into a colleague's personal space.
Or made a joke that had nothing to do with the work you were discussing, or decided that the artist you were speaking to
was someone that you wanted to see smile, or blush, or squirm.
You're going to start reflecting on all the ways that you come across.
This is the moment when you start to change.
Can you imagine what Australia's galleries and studios and public spaces and our entire contemporary art scene would look like
if nobody had to fear someone like you? That's what's going to happen now. Because all around the world, people are coming together to stop gendered harassment and sexual assault from remaining a normal part of our working lives.
And what this means for you is not going to be pleasant.
People are going to call you out on it, right there and then, to your face.
At work, in public, at an opening.
You're going to feel intimidated or humiliated or offended or distressed or hurt.
Or you could just stop behaving like this.
It's up to you.
Sincerely, the concerned colleague who started to have this conversation with you yesterday, but you wouldn't take me seriously, so I wrote this letter.
This piece still gives me goosebumps when I watch it. You'll see that we made this letter not gendered, because it's not about one gender. It's ultimately about power. We know that the steps between decision-making, discrimination and harassment are not great leaps. So I'd like us to step back, to look at the bigger picture of equity and opportunity. A few of us attended the Sheila's in the Art Market panel discussion here last night, and there were lots of stats presented on the lack of representation of women, female identifying and non-binary artists, and the unconscious bias against their work commercially. When we talk about gallery representation, it's largely about access. We can't discount who has access to support, space and education. Now Julie and Deborah, you're both part of this video piece, and in the last couple of weeks you and I separately have both had conversations about the abuse of power in the art world, and that has a lot to do with class and money and what that means for opportunity. Can you both reflect on being part of this video piece and your general thoughts on opportunity and abuse of power in our industry?
Where to start?
where to start? I guess I want to say something stupid to begin with, which is that actually I have never really experienced sexual harassment in the art world, I guess, because since I turned whatever is the magic age, it's like I got Harry Potter's cloak of invisibility, and potential harassers can't even see me, like a short, roly-poly woman, you know? Who is that?
Some people find very attractive, by the way. It's not about that.
But it is like I kind of vanished in a certain way from a certain scene, which has been kind of interesting, especially because, you know, every woman grows up to measure themselves in the reflection of the eyes of men, and it's really hard to untrain yourself from that. So, but, you know, I've been trying for centuries now.
For me, I'd be extremely curious to know what's happening in the art schools these days, because I did work in an art school, really great art school, Canberra School of Art, and I heard a huge amount about sexual harassment in art schools in Sydney when I was a student in the 70s at what was then called Alexander Mackie National Art School, chasing people around the sculpture room, you know, certain notorious graffiti on the Paddington campus suggesting who you might fuck or who might fail you. You know, so I mean, it was and it probably is a really live thing, but it was very, very live when I was young in the art schools. It was just out of control.
I must say, on my way here, I ran into two artists on the train, and I told them what we were going to speak about. And from Bondi Junction to Redfern, they overwhelmed me with salacious stories of art school, catastrophically unbalanced sexual relationships of various kinds in contemporary art schools. Of course, we got to Redfern and they said, you must mention none of this.
We can't mention any names because it's defamatory, but I want to draw attention to the fact that this was endemic in art colleges when the majority of the students have been for 100 years women, and for a long time the teachers were men. That's not the case now. It hasn't been the case, let's say, since Jenny Watson was a girl, and she's still teaching and doing like wonderful work. So that dynamic has changed very much, but it's still to be considered. And it must be said that I know for a fact, and many of us would know in the business, that there were also sexual harassments in some of our great museums, art museums, and not only men on women, but men on men. So there is a history. Sorry. There is a history, and it is something that is continually to be looked at, because we're talking about the abuse of power being no surprise, right? So yes. Jenny Holzer's 1977 version of that is just the most pithy expression of something that has been talked about for, you know, at least a couple hundred years.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Power and how it may be abused.
Absolutely. And I mean, just because you were just talking about art school, I mean, I was at COFA for 15 years, and in the last few years that I was there, we resorted to having security guards at the door of our openings at Kudos to stop the men, a gang of men that we knew were harassing female students, and just would not stop coming, regardless of how mean I was to them, how kind I was to them, how insistent I was that they not come. I could walk them out at an opening every week, and then the next week they'd be back. So we had, so it's not just academics, it's I guess people preying on young, but not necessarily always young, just people at the start of their careers who are open to what might be a potential door. So there's a lot of trust there that is abused.
And hope, I guess.
Hope, yeah. Nasim, I know you've had experiences in, just because we're talking about education, let's reflect on your experiences as an art student in Iran.
I can't comment about, does this work? Oh yeah. I can't comment about, of course, Australia because I've missed that 20 years of my life here that I spent in Iran. But growing up and going to artist schools, we never felt that sexual harassment at the school, at artist schools, because everything was on the watch constantly. Though, as soon as we graduated as artists now looking for galleries, that was when we felt there is a massive challenge outside the artist schools to deal with private sectors, with gallerists and curators who majority were male, and I think still that's the case inside Iran. And especially gallerists, they always sit and talk to you around the table, and that would never be about your artwork. So it's about you and how much more they can get with you. And as a male gallerist, you know, the next step is a dinner to go to and the house to be invited to. And then we all stepping back as female artists knowing what's going to happen next. So that never happened to me physically to be harassed by male gallerists, but I could see what's happening with others. So that slowly became a paranoia thing about we don't want to work to any art gallery, we don't want our work to be represented, we just really want to step away from male gallerists in Tehran. And there were two, but talking about this was very interesting because there was only 2 female representatives back in Tehran. I'm talking about 10 years ago. So I've just, again, since then, I don't know how much things has changed and how things are developing. I'm hearing from my female artists that this still exists and needs to be considered, but the only 2 very wealthy women who were running very big famous galleries in Tehran, they were only accepting young boys, and they're creating a little young boys club for as a galleries. That was also very hurtful to just deal with and to consider that I'm an artist, I don't have a place here. And that was one of the major reasons that my dad said, you want to be an artist, and you are a female artist, and you're in Tehran and Iran, you need to go out. You need to find another country when you can freely experience. So that was definitely, and I think it still is a thing to deal with a male gallerist when he has a power and money, and he loves to have his boys club, but if there's a female artist in the mix, what's going on there between them? Is that just the artist being an artist or more to it? So that was my really personal experience to share.
Thank you. Do you want to add to that, Julie?
I think, I mean, I'm just thinking as we're going that it's a complex panel because we're talking of abuse of power. So we started with sexual harassment, and then we're sliding towards gender bias, right?
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of
all interlinked.
It's all interlinked.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is really interesting because we're talking about the construction of the artist persona as a masculine one, and how that has gone on for a very long time and still goes on. Despite the contest stats that we saw last night, which are really great, which are just quite devastating in terms of participating numbers of women, which are changing, and in terms of the art market stats and the way Marco Navone and Maren Shriver from Bonhams dealt with that. Marco Navone's study is an international study about auction results, sales of auction results of women's work. So what we've been seeing is I think particularly after the Me Too movement, there's now a shift in Australian political life towards questions of gender bias in every aspect of life. I've only got a couple of things to add. I'll leave the obvious one behind, only quoting Julie Bishop to say that she thought that when the Liberal Party found a woman who could be leader, they would certainly probably put her in. That was the great statement of that week. But there's a couple of gender bias studies I wanted to quote very quickly. One was reported in the American Economic Review in 2000. It's brought to my attention by Lisa Lim, who's the composer leading a program at the Sydney Con. Orchestral auditions now, very commonly in the States, are conducted blind behind a screen. So if you want to be a cello in a big orchestra, let alone in Europe, we'll pass over that, you go behind a screen. In the very first tests, there were no differences in the results. That was weird until they worked out it was the sound of the shoes, click, click, clicking, on the way to, and then once the shoes became gender neutral, so did the results. Went to about 50-50. The other, yeah, it's great. The other result is quoted by Anne Sherry, a long-standing, well, she was in the Office for Women in Canberra, but now she's the chief executive of Carnival Cruises, which is a big cruise thing. And she has given a speech that was reported by Emma Alberici last Friday, which is about blind anonymous applications for work in telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, and other STEM areas. And when there are blind applications in those areas, the numbers of women rise from something like 1 in 10 to 50-50.
Wow.
So I'm really thinking that that is probably going to be something that's quite important for us in terms of recruiting for museums and art galleries, that to get to the interview stage, maybe
androgynous names.
Maybe an androgynous name or an anonymous proposal against the KPIs would be a good thing to do. That's in an industrial field where we are many women, but rarely at the very top of the field.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that anonymity would also have to cross race and class, because those things are extremely strong metrics by which discrimination happens. Because I guess part of my contribution to the preliminary discussions of this was that I thought that one of the very strongest lines in the art world about access to power is one of class and naked cash.
Yep.
And like my parents sent me to elocution classes for years so that I would sound like this. And I think that gives me a kind of disguise in a way that has allowed me to be, I don't know, I think that has really helped me, and that if I sounded working class, that it would be much, much harder. And I you know, it's a disguise, but it's totally working with my Harry Potter invisibility cloak.
The two of them together are unbeatable.
Yeah.
Vincent, let's talk about the piece that you wrote about Nat Randall's The Second Woman a few years ago as part of the Next Wave Writers program in 2016. Can you talk about this work and share your experience of watching it and participating in it and what you took away?
Yeah, well, so I was doing a writer's residency at Next Wave in Melbourne in 2016, and one of my minders or producers of that program was also producing Nat's show, and she asked me if I wanted to do the front of house job from 12 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. and I said, yeah, all right. I enjoy the witching hour, so I enjoy the nighttime freak, so I'll come along. And the front of house job was very minor. It was just like marking off who was coming in, and it was quite interesting. I guess that work really turned the male gaze. Like the male gaze was so turned back on itself in a way. It was a really, really interesting work, and I was, me and the producer were there making jokes, and she was like, you just have to mark who's coming in, and I was going, okay, but I can't actually tell, that guy, I think he came in before, what do I do if he's come in? And she was like, I can't expect you to distinguish between the different art men, like that's fine. And I was like, oh, this is this really interesting thing of like, the men became so objectified in that experience. It was quite funny. Like we were all joking about it, and I was the only man or like male identified person who was on the crew at all, and I was not really in the crew. I was just there, and then there was a gap at 4:30, and they asked me, "Oh, can you go in and do the 4:30 a.m." and they said, can you go in? I don't know if everybody's familiar with that work, but it was, Nat Randall was playing she was playing a character in a cube, a set where she performed the same scene like for 24 hours straight on the hour with 4 different participants an hour. So yeah, so I went in at 4:30, which was really, it was a really amazing, weird experience because I was like, I felt so self-conscious and I felt so like scrutinized or something. There was such pressure to do with how I would be seen, how I would be read, and I think that I had thought, because I'd watched it so many times, that I would be immune from that, because I knew what was going to happen, and I was really surprised at how similar my experience was to people who had just walked in the door and gone through the back. I felt so on the spot, and I think because I knew Nat from before, there was something, I was like, I'm really nervous, and there was something in that, like she was quite nice to me. It was interesting as well, I think, because, you know, I'm quite small, I'm not super masculine, so I think that it was easier for her to, she didn't have to contend with this fight that she had to with some other participants.
Yeah, I noticed in your piece that you wrote about it, you really identified the way some of the characters, I guess, tapped into a more physical and violent persona, and whether or not that, I mean, regardless of whether that's who they are as people or not, that was a weird observation.
It was very, so at the end of each scene, people could say, the participants could either say, I love you, or I've never loved you. And the people who said, I've never loved you, I was just like, what's going through your head that you would think that would be becoming of you, to say that, to play this character, like this, like, I guess it's like you're so free to enact misogyny all of the time, everywhere that you go, like with these stories that the others have been speaking about. And then there's this moment when it's so obvious that it's not acceptable, or that people are laughing at you, that like women are laughing at you. I was like, wow, you really must have people's feathers must be really ruffled. It makes people really uncomfortable to be, I don't know, scrutinised like that.
Yeah, I guess that's what we were aiming with the letter.
Yeah.
I'm going to flip forward to, we're going to come back to that. But I think, Nasim, I'd like to hear you talk about this work, Women in Shadows, that you, sorry about the image credit on that, it's blocked out a bit. But yeah, thinking about the objectification of women and where this work comes from.
Oh, ouchie. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with my practice, but I quickly give you some headlines with how the language in my art world is shaping is based on the differences and the cultural experiences I have had in the past with the whole Iran and Middle East, growing up as a female artist, as a female, and then wanted to be an artist. And then the first thing I had to experience is how you look outside in public in Iran, and how you need to be restricted by the rules and regulations that not necessarily is your choice. And I'm talking about those who want to be free, not those who chose to be covered. So that was the biggest challenge, that I was a sensitive soul dealing with it every day. And I knew I'm going to do something with this challenge in my mind and limitations of a woman and a female in Iran and in Middle East. And then when I came to Australia, as a child, we used to, in Iran, look at all the magazines, the fashion festivals in West, and just look up to it as something we can never do. So this is like, how can we just get there? How can we go to a fashion parade when we see all these beautiful women how could we ever get on the cover of a magazine? So I knew we would never get there back in Iran. So, but when I had this chance to come to Australia and start my art career, so I started working in fashion industry to just earn some money. And then I started attending a lot of catwalks and fashion parades that was just basically showing me what I couldn't see back home. So all these amazing female models, Western looking, you know, brilliant, tall, attractive on the stage. And then the whole two world come together to my head. And I thought I want to do this performance when I place these models on the stage and they wear what I experienced back home. And I see how they feel. So I replaced their identity with Middle Eastern identity on the stage in front of audience. And then at the end, through this performance, they become themselves and they become the model they are. And they get uncovered and they become that whole a person we see constantly in all these major festivals. So it's the number one performance I did in South Australia in 2011 as my graduation art performance piece. That was in Experimental Art Foundation back then. And the number two, I made this performance in earlier this year at Powerhouse Museum. So, and it's just amazing that how, no matter if you come from West or East, how much similarities as a woman you experience and difficulties and challenges. Because the more I started living in Australia, the more I realized these free women on the stage that we look up to from Middle East, they're actually not as free as we thought. So they all have numbers. So they all basically an object for their agents. So when I wanted to cast them in 2010, then I realized these are extremely limited models that they don't have name, they don't have personality, they're just a number. So I could choose between number 1 to 20. And I could have some free models from 20 to 30. And then I have to just, based on the card and the number, choose the number 12. I can afford the number 12. And then I raised the question to the modeling agent that, why don't you allow me to talk to them? They are human. So I want to make sure they're comfortable with my concept. And that was not a choice. It was basically, that's what you get. This is an album of our beautiful models. You just take the number and you pay for it, you can have them, and they can do whatever for you. And then again, when I talked to them one by one, and then they basically, most of them didn't want to be named model. So they were escaping that whole freedom that I looked up to experience. They totally didn't want to be called a model. They escaped it. They wanted to be called like they're doing admin, something else in their lives. And they're going through their therapies to be able to get over this experience of being looked at as an object constantly. So for me to place these two sides of the scale on a performance and a fashion parade catwalk, so it was something really heartwarming for myself to feel like this is not what we think in the East. So this is basically, it's not as traumatizing, it's not as obvious, it's not as hard and sharp, but it does exist in a certain way in the West for women.
Yeah, in a very obvious way. Deborah, I'm going to show I've got some early works of yours from the 80s. Can you tell us about these?
I sent you that picture because...
should I read out what it says? Can you all see that?
Yeah, I think you maybe can't read it on the big screen.
How can I protect you if you don't feel threatened?
Which is a cartoon that I did at the very beginning of my career while I was still a law student, I think, which was a terrible experience being a law student. But I ran away and I was doing cartoons for my university newspaper. And this work I did when I was like 20 or something, and now I'm 56, and I still think it's one of my best works of my whole life. I mean, I did a lot of pretty crummy cartoons, none of them funny, but this one I think still has power, and delicately expressed power.
Yep.
So it really talks about partly how women are invested in patriarchy as well. So, I mean, I think my best work doesn't make blame simple.
What about this one?
That one does. This isn't one of my best works, but it's kind of funny because, especially in the wake of the rape and murder of Eurydice Dixon in Melbourne, when immediately the police said, well, women just have to be more careful, something very, very similar happened in 1984, I think, in Melbourne, where a woman was dragged off a tram stop, and, you know, I don't need to tell you. And the police really uncritically put out repeated warnings to women to stay home. You know, and obviously home is where most women are assaulted, killed, and everything else. Yeah. And my friend Tracy Wall, who I went on to start a disco with, actually, but part of why I really liked her was that she had this huge electric megaphone, and she mounted it to the top of her car, and she drove around the streets of Fitzroy, which is where this terrible attack had happened and where we all lived at that time. And she was announcing a curfew on all men. Because it was so outrageous that women were being told to stay home.
Yeah.
And nobody was addressing perpetrators. So the police weren't addressing perpetrators. The blame was put on the victims. It was so outrageous. Anyway, so I just was making a cartoon out of that thing that Tracy had done. So this is as if, I guess it's a science fiction cartoon, which also takes, you know, they call sanitary pads and tampons feminine protection. So I was playing with that as well, and suggesting that this was going to just be the news.
Yeah.
That there was going to be a curfew on men. They weren't going to be allowed out after 6 because of the danger to us.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up those stories. I mean, really what's happened at the beginning of this year with the increasing reports of murders of women and the metoo movement. As I mentioned, the reason that we created that letter is largely because of the number of complaints we were receiving in the office. So Vincent, the reason I brought you here is really let's talk about some practical strategies and some frameworks for how to report what might have happened to you without putting yourself in danger.
Yeah.
And how to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, I guess that those things are connected, but for me, there's like frameworks and ideas and like cultural change, and then there's strategies of how people can keep themselves safe or like call out the shitty things that happen to them or to their friends, or the shitty things that their friends do to other people, as you were talking about in that video. I think, so my framing and my understanding of this comes from community education projects that I've done in Melbourne with a group called Undercurrent Victoria, and they've been doing community education stuff for around almost 8 years, and that came out of I guess what you're talking about, like complaints or people within social scenes saying, oh, this has happened, or this person has sexually assaulted me, so I want something to be done about that. And then the people who started this group realised that the community weren't ready. People weren't ready to change their behaviour or to be called out on that stuff, and so they moved to community education in high schools and in TAFEs and unis. So that's been the majority of my work for the last 4 years. I guess I'll talk a little bit about frameworks before I think about strategies. The way that we, and reflecting on the stories that the other panellists have told, I think it's so contested, but what like splitting groups of people by gender, because often like in high schools those people are split by their birth assignment, and that doesn't work for everybody, and so it can be really complicated in that situation. But I think there is something really important about giving young women, or like, you know, people who are going through school, like as young women, giving them a space away from the majority of young men. But then as well, those groups of young men, you know, I go into those spaces and I can see that people aren't having the same experience of gender, or there might be somebody there who's having a really different experience to that like popular cis boy over there, and is experiencing a lot of the same kind of abuse of power as maybe some of the young women students are. And so what we try to do is, I guess, encourage critical thinking. That's all you can really do to change people's culture or their association with stuff, is encourage critical thinking and give support skills, especially for young people, because they don't feel listened to, they don't feel like they're relevant, they feel like if you're an adult and you just come in and you're like, now listen fellas, you need to not do this, then they're just like, fuck off, I don't care. So I think it's quite, I guess on the flip side of Deborah's point about women being agents in patriarchy sometimes, it's very interesting when I speak to teenage boys and I notice the ways that they are making inroads or like resisting patriarchy, and they don't even maybe realize they're doing that. But I guess strategies that I think about when, because I also like my day job is like a domestic violence support service. So I always say to people, you know, stuff like record evidence, screenshot, just all of the paranoid drama queen things that you should just really do. And like email, like if you have things on email, it's better than if it's on the phone. Probably everybody else could attest to the importance of those things. I guess for maybe especially for men, like I think that intervening in like misogyny and abuse of power is really important, and if there's a way you can do that without making yourself like, I think we have to make ourselves uncomfortable. It is really uncomfortable to stand up to somebody who has more power than you, but you kind of have to.
You have to.
You just have to.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that, Julie?
The smile on my face is thinking about being at a famous artist's wedding and somebody was kind of all over me. It was a long time ago. Someone was all over me, and Brandon Cavallari, who some of you may remember, said, "Do you like that, Julie? Do you actually enjoy that? Is that kind of congenial to you? Is that okay with you, what he's doing?" And I said, "No, you're dead right, it's not." It's 1985. It was fantastic. So I'm really sorry that the other guy, who was quite a famous artist, was humiliated. But you know what? He never did it again.
I'm not sorry. There's something to be said for
Neither am I.
shame. Like shame is a motivating factor.
I'm sorry, but it was what was happening, and I was forever grateful.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to work out how I could stamp on his toes or something, and that wouldn't have been very polite in a wedding reception at the Queen's Club.
Was it the groom?
No.
Oh God.
You must be joking. No.
Yeah, I mean, it's super, and we ask for that in the public letter. It's super important to call people out when you see them. Don't walk away and think it's not my business.
Presence of mind, if we can have it.
Yeah. I mentioned at the beginning that NAVA is doing a lot of work in this territory. I'll also mention, just because we're talking about reporting things, that we're currently working with a number of sector organisations and legal experts to develop whistleblower protocols for the anonymous reports of gendered harassment and sexual assault. At this stage, we're in partnership with a law firm in Melbourne and have drafted a Speak Up protocol. I mean, facilitating the anonymous reporting is also important from the perspective of encouraging disclosures.
I want to add to something to that
please.
right now, which is to say, when we were discussing this before, part of what we were saying is there is so much that we cannot say.
Yeah.
And so the words that you're hearing are squeaking past some very high gates.
Yep.
There are things that must not be said publicly and by us with our names on them. So anonymous reporting is critical.
Yeah, I think at the moment we're sort of hit a bit of a block because to do anonymous reporting, you need some sort of box crypter like Wisply that I know some other sectors are using. It's so that you can, it's an encryption software so you can upload information without your name or anything personal attached. So an organisation or a board of an organisation can find out if a director or another staff member are doing something and it can't be traced to you personally. So as an artist, you're protected. The problem with that kind of software is that it's $99 a year per user. So that's not something that we're taking up, but we are investigating other options. If anyone has any leads, it'd be super great. Another thing that has been really big that's come out of recent work at the beginning of the year has been, and we know that there's been a lot of public statements from the screen industry and not a lot in the visual arts, but Arts South Australia published a respectful behaviours policy and a stand against bullying and harassment. And the Australia Council also wrote to all their funded organisations to remind them of their responsibilities in this area also. And I did hear last night that someone was talking about an article on ArtNet about ethics protocols for art fairs, which I haven't seen. No, it was a panellist. I haven't found that either, but we'll be looking into that because we're also currently working on a major revision of NAVA's Code of Practice for the visual and media arts, craft and design sectors. For those of you who don't know, the code is both a record and a benchmark of best practice across the visual arts, which includes legal, ethical and financial business practices, as well as thorough art industry guidelines. And we have identified that it's currently missing any reference really to equal opportunity or gendered harassment protocols. So we'll be working with the sector on developing those over the next couple of years. We've got about 9 minutes left. I might throw open to questions now, which also could be questions from you guys. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yes? 2. I think we're recording, so it'd be really great if you could use the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the panel for your amazing discussion and for sharing with us. My question is, and it's for Vincent, I'm particularly interested in the fact that you were talking before about educating younger generations in these sort of strategies and frameworks to avoid this sort of abuse of power per se. One thing that really struck me about that was there was an advertising campaign where I sort of live, and it was targeting young men, and it was saying, or men who identify as men, or whatever, people who identify as men, and it was sort of a domestic abuse campaign and targeting potential people who may, become perpetrators one day. And what I really didn't like about this campaign was that it targeted a specific group, and it said you are most likely to become violent perpetrators, and calling those people out. And it targeted a younger demographic, but what I would have liked to have seen is it targeting an older demographic. The ads in this, the imagery in this campaign, for anyone who's not familiar, was entirely young men, and I'm wondering what your opinion is on why that is necessarily a bad sort of campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Sydney, but I've been living in Melbourne for about 4 or 5 years, and we have similar, like, the Victorian government is doing heaps of campaigns like this as well, but towards adult men. So yeah, but I do remember the ones that are targeted specifically towards young men and stuff like, oh, don't cross the line, or like you, yeah, these little buzzwords like this. I mean, I usually, it's quite far removed from the work that I have done, in that my work is about like actually finding out what people think, and yeah, what I was thinking while you were speaking about that is often I'll say to this group of year 9s, I'll say like, so where do these ideas come from? Like, where do we get these ideas that men are less emotional than women are? And they're like, oh yeah, dad, or family. I think, and they know where everything comes from, and it's because it's just there. It's just that no one ever talks about it. So I guess I think there's something really powerful about making young people feel empowered to make different decisions to what their parents or elders do. But I always put such value in like asking older people who've done work before in this area, like for their practice wisdom, I suppose. But yeah, I just wouldn't engage with a ad like that. I just would be like, yeah, it's hard to engage with something if you feel like it targets you, even if it's true. It's just hard. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great.
Any comments from?
It sounds like I don't remember seeing that campaign. Maybe I was oblivious to it because it wasn't targeting me. But it sounds like it's telling you something, not asking you whether you are likely to be. And that maybe is just a mistake in address.
Did you get the microphone? Oh, I just had someone at the back. Okay, you also.
Hi.
Pass to you, sorry.
So my question's for Deborah Kelly. I recently saw one of your works, Lying Women in Art Space, and there was something about like the soundtrack that you chose that was really like activating and very like a very methodical drum beat. And it kind of seemed like a bit of a call to action to change sort of the representation of women in galleries. And I just wanted to ask, like, what has your experience been sort of working in Sydney? Because, like with such a high graduation rate of females, and then doesn't always reflect into representation in gallery spaces, and how have you sort of navigated that? Because you are getting quite a lot of representation at the moment. I've seen your works in a few spots.
I sometimes I'm sorry, this is not going to be a very instructive answer, but people do say to me, what was your trajectory? A lot. And the thing is, I was a cartoonist. I was like an enraged feminist cartoonist. And I magically turned into a contemporary artist, and I kind of don't know how that happened. It wasn't like my plan. There was a moment, because I do graphic design to support my stupid life as an artist, and there was a moment where I was being thwarted and prevented from doing really good work, and I thought, I'm just going to have to be my own client. And I think that was so I started making works just for myself, with myself as a client, making works that I just longed to see in the world. And I think maybe that was the magic moment when then, of course, I wanted them to be in the world, and then there they were. I don't know if you know a work I made with Tina Fiveash in 2000, which was started to be shown in 2001, called Hey Hetero, which talks about the privileges of heterosexuality, which I think to that moment it's like nobody had noticed. It's one of those things as ubiquitous as whiteness, where, you can't feel it because it's everywhere, the power of whiteness. So heterosexuality, through the lens of whiteness studies, actually seemed to me to be really ripe to be looked at and prodded and articulated. So, but I'm just going to tell you one more thing, but it's not going to add up to a coherent story. that is, I worked for more than 20 years in Melbourne, mainly in the trade union movement, and I was super active. I did a huge amount of art things in the trade union movement, to the point where people were really like, oh, Deborah Kelly, you again. And I never showed in a gallery, and I really did try. And the two curators that I did approach, whose names I won't mention, said to me, even after that I started being my own client, they said, you know what, like, you're not actually an artist. You're kind of more of a trumped up graphic designer. And I was like, oh, rats. But then I came to move to Sydney for love, not for a career, because I didn't have a plan for a career. And all of a sudden people started ringing me up and going, are you like Deborah Kelly, the political artist from Melbourne? I was like, yes. Wow, are you a detective? So I don't know how it happened.
We have one question at the back. Can you pass the... Thank you.
Just going back to your comments relating to blind auditions and how that might apply in the art world, I was just thinking about artist statements, and if you're working in gender or potentially even in politics, how you'd go about writing the artist statement in an androgynous type fashion, and whether that's, you know, being culture blind or gender blind or whatever. Artist statements, I would think, are actually quite difficult to remove from that context.
There's a few ways that I see. I don't have a recommendation. I have seen a few artists deliberately androgynize their names for that purpose, I imagine. And I know that Barry gave an example last night, which is that he encouraged one of his artists, Jessica, to shorten her name to Jess, which he did, and he did identify that she made a lot more sales under the name of Jess, and often some of the buyers believed that they were buying the male artist's work, and he did not correct them. But I've also seen like a Jacqueline, short to Jack. I've seen people just use the first initial, so not the full name. Yeah, do you have any other?
That's a 19th century strategy. Yeah. It certainly works in terms of sales, but it doesn't really kind of represent the person, right. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just like a little tip of the iceberg thing, and you've got to really address the question of valuing different cultural positions and expressions.
We're going to wrap up now, and I want a comment, a lasting action from each of our panelists.
Oh my God.
Come on.
You didn't tell us about this before.
No, it's a surprise. It's a surprise question.
I have thought of one. It's in Melbourne. In the last 2 years, galleries or artist collectives or bands or social scenes have contacted Undercurrent Victoria, the community education project I work with, and asked us to come and do a purpose-built workshop talking about, just what we're talking about and start conversations in their galleries. So I guess it's quite, it's one thing to sit up here and be with these amazing people, and that I feel so honoured to be here. But I think that there are people who want to change. People want to change things, and they're looking for around for whatever they can see that might enable them to start having these conversations. So, we're in Melbourne, so we can't come up here and do that. We have no funding, completely volunteer run, but it's.
But someone could pay you to come up.
Yeah, and there's hope in that, I think.
Yep, good, thank you. Julie?
I'm going to take a cue from Vincent. When I was working at the MCA in the mid-90s, we had a little bit of money to do whole of museum education once a year. On the occasion when we had the Robert Mapplethorpe show in 1995, the entire museum, from the gallery services to the director, we all did HIV/AIDS awareness training, right? But everybody. And I think the next time we did public speaking. But for everybody. That was very good for nearly everybody except the one person who didn't come. But the point is, if you get a whole population in a workplace all having the same kind of conversation together. That's immensely valuable because it takes a village.
Yep, that's true.
To raise a child or protect each one of us.
Thank you.
I wish I could think of a really good action.
You
but
are
I've
the
spent my
action.
entire life trying to think of a really good action.
Share one you've already done.
But I guess I'm just going to think right now that perhaps we can all attend to the hectic conversation going around about the representation of Serena Williams. Because that brings us to, I think, to recognize the level of racist misogyny at play in public life in this country.
It's sickening.
So, yeah, I think really attend to that conversation.
Yeah.
And it's how poisonous it is.
Yeah.
That's my action.
Yeah. Nasim?
It's very hard to say, but just I think as an artist who always struggled to fit in, no matter in the East or West, the only thing I can say is just there are not many free things in the world. So one free things we can do is support each other and help each other just whenever we can. Because maybe nobody knows, but just even for an artist, when the art gets collected, gets curated, gets published, when an issue gets discussed, it nourishes the soul in many levels. And especially individually, I'm speaking as an artist and a film artist, it means a lot. And I still think no artist will forget the first exhibition they've done. No writers would forget the first place when they publish a text, but it won't happen without support of each other and help of each other, wherever we can.
Yep.
And it's regardless of gender and sexuality, it's just one-on-one connection that we make every day.
Yep. Self-care, collective care. Perfect note to wrap up on. Thank you for joining me in this very difficult conversation that we probably could have spent a torturous week on. But thank you, and thank you for everybody for coming here today.